Everybody to our last session, and as you know, LEA will be our speaker. LEA is very well known for her work on a lot of topics: political agency, political activism, global justice, colonialism, migration, immigration, Kant. Basically, it's impossible to teach a course in political philosophy without having one of their pieces in the mandatory readings, the list of the mandatory readings. And this evening, she will speak of the moral art of as-if history.
Thank you very much for your kind words, Valeria, and thank you to everyone for being here. The title of the paper is was the moral art in as-if history, and the paper was an attempt to talk about the idea of progress, both moral and political progress, in connection to Kant's understanding of the philosophy of history. But I decided to give a more abstract summary of what I think are the more important points of that paper from a more analytical perspective. So there'll be a slight change, for a slight departure from what was initially planned, with two caveats, which is that what I'm about to present now is the summary of a book project, and so I apologize if it's basically there's too many ideas packed in it. And the second apology is that the book has not been written yet. So it's even more provisional in that sense, but I'm hoping that the questions and the summary will be clear enough to feed into a productive discussion. The paper is about the idea of progress and about the idea of political progress more specifically. Progress is both a necessary idea and a dangerous idea. It's necessary from a moral point of view whenever we try to improve the way things are, and whenever we talk about moral normativity and how agents ought to behave when we think about the real world implications of their actions and what might follow. It's also important and necessarily embedded in everyday political discourse and moral discourse, because we want to be able to say and make statements of the kind, I made progress with my paper, or I gave the conference is making progress, or more seriously, we want to also be able to, when we talk about different social and political movements active throughout history, be able to identify a regressive from a progressive political movement. And so we want to say, for example, that the abolition of slavery or the enfranchisement of women in the public sphere were progressive movements, whereas campaigns to exclude migrants or to enact racist policies are regressive. And so we want to somehow preserve this distinction. That's where the necessity of the idea of progress comes from. But it's also a dangerous idea, because as we know, those of us who know about the Western experiences of colonialism and oppression and domination of other parts of the world were often done in the name of progress, and the emancipation and civilizing mission of the West was also connected to the necessity of imposing a certain way of thinking about progress, and in fact these were also seen as progressive battles. So this is why perhaps the kind of both necessity, but more recently the dangerousness of the idea of progress has led to a kind of exclusion of the topic and the concept from our political theoretical debate. So it seems that there is a need to go back to thinking about what progress might be, and to also reflecting more seriously about what it means to say that political progress, that the movement is progressive, and what does it mean to say that our institutions are progressive or regressive. So this paper is an attempt, or this project is an attempt to contribute at both levels, to first try and say, well, what do we mean when we say that we make progress? And second, what does it mean more specifically to say that a set of agents and institutions are progressive? And more specifically still, what does it mean to say that it's politically progressive? And is there a distinction between political progress and moral progress? So these are the kinds of concepts that I would like to unpack in what follows. So let me start with, what does the postulate of progress mean? What do we mean when we say that something is progressive, and when we talk about history, for example, being progressive or there being progress in history? My suggestion is to locate this analysis of progress in terms of a kind of propositional attitude that is located between two extreme kinds of beliefs. So the first one, when we say that something is progressive, we mean that progress is not impossible. And that does sound plausible, but it's almost trivial, because the strength of the proposition is gained from the weakness of the alternative, which is to say that progress is impossible. And those who say, well, progress is impossible, are clearly committed to a kind of prophetic theorizing about the future and to being able to foresee what's going to follow. And it seems implausible to say that progress is impossible just because we don't know. And so we might say, well, of course, if we say progress is possible, that's one propositional attitude, but a weak one because it seems so obvious and trivial. The second, so that's one extreme. The second propositional attitude is to say that moral progress is necessary. And that seems to be too strong. The first one is too weak because it's trivial, and the second is too strong. And the reason is that in arguing for the necessity of progress, both moral and political, one seems to misunderstand the nature of the agent that is responsible for making progress if we connect it to that agent being moral and acting in a morally required way. And the reason is that that agent is free, and therefore it's not necessary precisely because the agent is free to follow a moral ought just as much as to depart from the moral ought and to choose what Kant would say the kind of the root of evil rather than the moral principle. So prophetic history of this kind is also unwarranted because if it were warranted, the prophet wouldn't be actually free to act in the way in which it's required. Because in this case, we couldn't really predict the future course of events when an agent is free to choose whether to depart or to follow a moral ought. So I think to say and to believe in progress is therefore to say more that progress is not impossible, but less than progress is not necessary. And the objections that tend to be moved to this account, of what I'm going to follow, often take one of these implications and say, well, whatever you're trying to say in the middle of these two propositional attitudes either collapses in the first in the kind of triviality of saying, well, of course it's plausible and possible, or collapses into the necessity idea. And I'm hoping to try and avoid both of them, but I don't know how successfully. We'll see. So one obvious reason for why we might be interested in progress and why this is, I think, an important question is to say that it's important, talking about progress in moral discourse is important from the point of view of the consequences of moral action. And I think often those who discuss Kant's account of progress, for example, or Kant's account of moral theory, say that it's important to believe in progress so that we can cultivate hope in things turning out for the better. They also say that it's important to have hope because hope is a strong motivation for our action and that we need this kind of motive in order to be able to do the right thing. But I think caring about progress from the point of view of the consequences of moral action is unwarranted, because imagine you could motivate people to do the right thing just by frightening them and terrorizing them and by fear. So imagine you would be able to tell a story about how things unfold in history by saying, well, look at how horribly people have behaved towards each other, think of how much slaughter and oppression and violence and domination there is around, you get so scared that you then might be motivated to do the right thing just because you don't want to fall into that kind of world order. So it seems that if we want to think about why we might need to have a philosophical conversation about progress rather than regress, we need to say something about the foundations of normativity and why it's desirable to have a concept of progress in our moral discourse, not just from the point of view of the consequences of moral action, but from the point of view of why it is that it's necessary to the kind of odd statements that come with a certain conception of agency. And in my project, as I say, I'm interested in odd statements, but I'm even more specifically interested not just in the question of moral progress, but in the more detailed and specific question of political progress as distinct from moral progress. So what I'm going to say in a minute is where I see the differences between moral and political progress and how we might want to talk about political progress, in some ways anchoring our account of political progress to moral progress. So why might that be desirable? I think that is desirable if we are committed to a kind of view about the foundations of normativity that wants to take seriously both a kind of dogmatic objection to morality and a skeptic objection to morality. So the dogmatic objection to morality, and that's where the sort of the initial inspiration for the paper came from Kant's moral theory, because Kant championed the kind of moral theory that one might say sort of constructivist moral theory that takes seriously both the danger of reification of certain values and taking them as given to us and sort of intuitively true, and therefore inspiring moral action. So Kant wants to depart from them and say, well, that's dogmatic because we don't know what the moral truth is. But on the other hand, is also committed to an account of normativity that is still not relativistic. And so while avoiding this dogmatic objection, wants to give you an account of normativity that is intersubjectively grounded in the way that is stronger and a response to the moral skeptic that is a little bit stronger than the one that just says, well, since they're man-made, then therefore they're subjective to change and their bindingness is also subject to dispute. So the constructivist answer to the problem of morality is familiar and is clearly inspired by this attempt that Kant makes to articulate a version of normativity that is a response to both the dogmatic and the skeptic by talking about moral norms as something that is subjectively or intersubjectively shaped and justified by following a certain procedure of justification that gives account of certain plausible and valid, intersubjectively valid moral norms. Now, of course, the skeptic might at that point turn to the constructivist and say, well, of course, the skepticism about the content of norms that was initially avoided through the intersubjective of justification might turn into a skepticism about the procedure of construction of moral norms, because how do we then know that the procedure itself is reliable and sufficiently justified? And of course, the constructivist response is there to say that the procedure can be vindicated reflexively, and that's to say that reason is a kind of faculty that is able to vindicate the moral norms that it constructs by looking at the way in which it is constructed, and therefore by being disciplined in the way in which it deploys certain moral tools to construct moral norms, and also guided by a kind of practical interest in generating these norms. So the constructivist response to the skeptic and the dogmatic is to then talk about reason as the process of construction of rational moral norms as a sort of learning process that is also vindicated reflexively. And then the answer is to say, well, how do we then know that these learning processes are themselves valid and justified? How do we know that what reason builds in the process of accumulating the tools for constructing certain moral norms is itself is itself a justified enterprise? How do we know that we don't err when we make these choices about the tools that we deploy? So that's where I think the connection between learning processes and reason, understood as a faculty that builds on learning processes, and a kind of process of trial and error that needs to be vindicated, connects to the idea of progress. And I'm going to say a bit more on that throughout the paper. But basically, and that question comes up both in moral theory and I think ought to come up more in political theory as well if we want to distinguish between moral and political progress. So in the case of moral theory, the account of moral progress that is given by thinking about how to vindicate the learning processes of reason in the process of vindicating certain moral norms is by thinking about moral theory as a kind of evolutionary experience, or a sort of evolutionary account of moral theory. And so authors of a kind of pragmatic inclination often talk about ethics as, in functional terms, as a learning process through which the tools of reason giving from a moral perspective get refined. And so authors like, starting from Dewey, but more recently Philip Kitcher, talk about moral progress as problem solving. And what they do when they talk about moral progress as problem solving is to give you an evolutionary account of the way in which ethics is connected to certain functional types of statement, whereby then through the functional refinement of ethics, we come to refine the tools through which ethics builds up on certain plausible moral norms. So in the project on political progress, I'm hoping to rely on part of this pragmatic literature on moral progress in order to raise the distinctive question of what political progress is, and to try and think about what could be a functional equivalent of ethics in the case of political theory, and what is the distinctiveness of political theory in thinking about the question of political progress. However, the issue of functional accounts and functional differentiation, functional refinement of norms is central to both the the reflection on moral progress and the reflection on political progress. So from a moral perspective, people like Kitcher and so on want to say that ethics is seen as a process of functional differentiation of the altruism failures of human beings in the course of cooperating to solve problems throughout the history of humanity. And they say that function statements are familiar in the philosophy of biology when we talk about how, and in fact they've also been used by political theorists like G.A. Cohen and so on, when we talk about certain capacities as being responsive to certain functions of the human being, in this case functions that have to do with odd-type statements. And I want to remain committed to that, but say that there is a distinctive problem that arises for political theory that is distinctive from moral theory when we talk about the function of ethics as remedying altruism failures. Because even if we assume, as moral philosophers do, that human individuals are moral, there are two further questions that political theorists tend to be interested in, that moral theory is not necessarily interested in from this perspective, which is, first, even if we assume that individuals all separately act in the right way, what is it that guarantees that their moral actions will be coordinated also in the right way? And so that's one question, is that of coordination. So how do we know that even if I act to do the right thing, that everyone else will also be a moral agent and do the right thing? That's one problem. The second problem is the problem, what I call the problem of continuity of moral norms. So even if I act in the right way, and even if I assume that other people will act in the right way, what guarantees that the body of norms that we have collectively shaped will stay like that in the future? And that seems to be crucial to the account of reason as a learning process, the preservation of whatever reason constructs in terms of moral norms. So if we then think about what distinctiveness of politics and political theory is, it seems to be an answer to this question of coordination on the one hand and continuity on the other. And so we tend to think that what makes political theory a distinctive, though related field of inquiry, is the ability to reflect on the construction of political and social institutions able to respond to these two issues that ethical theorists don't necessarily take seriously. So first there's the question of coordination of moral norms, and second the question of continuity of moral norms. So basically, once the problem of assurance is taken seriously, problem of coordination, so how do I know that other people do the right thing, and the second one, problem of continuity, we can say that political institutions embody and are required to embody a sort of collective authority that is required to shape and discipline individual behavior in the right way so as to address these two problems. Now, this collective authority that is at the foundation of politics can be effective if it conditions the development of human practices through a combination of sanctioning and punishment. And for short, through the exercise of power. And that's why power is at the center of political theory, because what we come up with is an account of political authority able to shape and to create constraints on agents' individual behavior that is central to the foundation of their life together. So it seems that the exercise of political power, from a political perspective, is essential and necessary to overcome the limits of altruistic norms and dispositions, even if we concede that altruistic norms and dispositions are essential to recognize the need for power, and that's where the link between ethics and political theory seems to be. But the problem of the generation and replication of forms of political rule through the exercise of power is different from the generation of moral norms through voluntary efforts. And so if we think about moral progress as a kind of progress that is captured by the functional refinement of altruistic dispositions, it might be plausible to think of a political analog to the idea of moral progress that might need to capture the idea of how we conceptualize the exercise of political power in a way that is also subject to functional refinement. So if remedying altruistic failures is at the center of ethics, and if power is at the center of politics, then what we need is an account, a functional account of the use of power in politics throughout sort of history. So this is where sort of the center of my project is, trying to think about how do we conceptualize in a way that is corresponding to this functional way of thinking about the refinement of political norms in this case, and that thinks about power as subject to functional refinement in this way. And that's so the second contribution is to think about what is the basic way of one might be able to account of functional refinements in the case of political theory. And that's where I go back to dear old John Rawls when he says that justice is the first virtue of political institutions. So whether that has always been the case, or whether it's the result of us thinking about political institutions in a certain way that we now have come to conceptualize of justice as the first virtue of political institutions, doesn't really matter for my purposes. What matters is to think about why it is that we've come to recognize that justice is important. And it seems to be because it helps us think about the way in which norms that regulate the exercise of power are arrived at. So it seems that justice is a kind of equivalent to the remedying of altruistic dispositions in the case of ethics to thinking about power. So the way in which we rationalize the use of power and we make it accountable and recognizable to the agents on which it's exercised is by thinking about the difference between just and unjust forms of rule, and just and unjust political institutions, and just and unjust exercises of power. So basically, justice helps us reflect on the way in which the exercise of power should be regulated, allowing us to ask questions concerning who exercises it, how it's exercised, for what reasons, and through what means. And so it seems that justice seems to play in the political domain an equivalent role to what norms of ethical refinement play in the interpersonal realm. So in the interpersonal realm, we tend to think about how individuals relate to each other, and we tend to think of a kind of evolutionary account of ethics norms in those terms. And I suggest in the case of politics, we could think of an equivalent to the way in which ethical dispositions are developed by thinking about how institutions exercise political rule and by thinking about the degree of justification of political institutions. So if the function of ethics is to remedy altruistic failures, the function of justice might be to regulate the way in which collective authorities exercise power in the presence of social conflict and due to the problems of coordination and continuity that I mentioned above. So if we think of ethical progress as a process of ethical refinement that involves the emergence and consolidation of moral norms and as a kind of learning process through which more and more appropriate remedies to altruistic failures emerge, then we might think of political progress as the process of refinement of justice-based norms. That's basically the summary of how I think about what political progress might mean. So that is to say that in the course of cooperating to solve political problems, human beings come up with principles and schemes for addressing conflicts among them that might be more or less adequate and more or less justified. And that's where the kind of learning curve is important. So the nature of what counts as a political problem will obviously be different at particular times and places, but it's plausible to assume that people will, in the course of struggling with these problems, come up with different interpretation of what power is, who is it exercised by, through what means, and in what ways. And answering the question is basically one way to address the initial question, which is what do we mean when we say that we make political progress? And my answer is that what we mean when we say that we make political progress is we think about to what extent justice-based norms are refined and in what way the function of justice is refined throughout generations, such that the coercive exercise of the use of power is more or less justified. And we also think further about the tools through which we come up and the decision-making processes through which we come up to answer these questions. Now, it's important to clarify that when we ask the question in these kind of broad terms, we don't need to think of this process as one that is driven initially or all the time by reason-giving or by the kind of peaceful endorsement of certain principled alternatives. And we also don't have to think of it as a kind of linear process that occurs without any lapses to unjustified regressive forms of accounting for how power ought to be exercised. In fact, I suggest that the emergence of different principles of justice and the plurality of the schemes on the basis of which political authority might be justified is determined by a range of factors. And we can acknowledge here, for example, the brutal imposition of coercive systems of rules on the side of powerful elites, the successive abolition of previously oppressive and exploitative institutions by dissatisfied social groups, the progressive and peaceful establishment of an ethos of challenge to dominant discourses through a combination of intellectual works and political struggle. So there's a whole range through which the refinement of justice-based norms of political mechanisms might occur. And the genealogy, this range will suggest that also the genealogy of different political forms of rule is varied. But the point of reflecting on political progress as a process of refinement of justice-based norms is that we can deploy a similar genealogy to reflect critically on existing forms of rule and to continue to develop further the process of learning from the trials, failures, and successes of the past. So how does that further occur? Well, it might be possible to reflect on the different interpretations of the way in which political institutions respond to the concerns and commitments of the people who are subjected to them. So the idea is institutions exercise power, individuals are subjected to the use of power, and there's a range of mechanisms through which that exercise of power is made accountable, more or less, to those who are subjected to it, and justice is exactly that. And it doesn't just concern the content of the norms of justice, but it might also concern the way in which we make decisions about what counts as justice. And so it might also go down to a kind of second order attempt to reflect on procedures and different regime types as a way of embodying these procedures. And so here one might say that different regime types, and so if we think about old-fashioned political theory of the kind that Aristotle or Plato were interested in, where they talked about, let's say, oligarchy, aristocracy, and democracy as different forms of rule, we might say, well, these are also attempts to address this question of how do you justify political power by thinking about the procedures through which the justification of political power occurs. And so we might think then that the emergence of democracy is one way through which one can address this problem and then compare democracy to other forms of rule in this way of trying to understand the refinement of justice-based dispositions. This seems to be, it seems to me a more productive way to account for political progress as a process through which different forms of rule are related to the production of forms of justice as they evolve in the response to the problem of the coercive use of power. And one might raise the same question when it comes to regime types now, so one might think about more contemporary forms of exercise of political rule, and so democracy versus technocracy versus populism and so on. So these might all be thought of as attempt to theorize about political institutions in a way that asks how do political institutions address the problem of justice and how do they respond to the concerns and commitments of the agents that are subjected to these institutions. So there is, at this point, there are several objections to this account. Do I have time to go into the objections, or shall I just? There are several objections. One of them is that one that might say that we don't know whether a particular practice is progressive unless we know the direction of a certain movement. And we don't know if a particular direction is right or wrong if we have access to a kind of independent standard that tells us where to go. However, if we want to maintain that political progress is made by correcting the mistakes of the past rather than being able to foresee the future, we must be able to rely, one might say, on actual historical practices as making an important contribution to carrying forward the functional reification, the functional refinement of norms. However, the problem with proceeding in this kind of fallibilist way that takes seriously learning from the past is that it kind of raises a difficulty, which is that the historical survival of a specific moral outlook might not be sufficient evidence of the plausibility of the norms that underpin it. And so there might be an objection that says, and I call this the arrogance of the present objection, that says, well, you only think that this is the right answer because this is the one that you're finding yourself with. But couldn't a particular set of norms have prevailed simply through the coercion of those who were subjected to it by another powerful group, or by manipulating preferences and desires, or by the sheer elimination of alternative forms of thinking? And so wouldn't then our current beliefs and practices simply reflect the outcome of the power struggle rather than anything more dignified from a normative perspective? Now, I think this objection, which I call the arrogance of the presence objection, would have force if we were willing to recognize as valid any criteria on the circumstances under which agents uphold certain forms of rule and a particular interpretation of the function and purpose of the institutions that exercise power over them. But I think we don't need to be as charitable. We don't need to take as plausible and relevant any interpretation of how these rules consolidate themselves, how these institutions consolidate certain forms of rule. We could say that the function of justice is refined only if successive generations are willing to endorse the same principles, even in circumstances that display none of the constraints of the original condition under which the norm emerged. So if a norm is subject to, say, manipulation of certain preferences and so on, and that norm is upheld even without this manipulation of these preferences, then we might say, well, the norm then has more plausibility than one that is maintained through sheer manipulation. So to explain this point, let me give an example that kind of goes back to the idea of progress in politics as a functional refinement of justice-based norms. So one of the fundamental functions of justice might be to justify the coercive use of power by regulating access to the benefits and burdens of cooperation in a way that avoids conflict and secures compliance. Now, that function will be served through different social and political arrangements based on different regulating principles at different points in time. Now, suppose that one such set of institutions generates norms of deference to authority based on birth rank, so it's a kind of aristocracy form of rule. And suppose further that this is the only conceivable norm at the time in which it emerges. Thanks to the power and coercive means of those belonging to a higher rank, call them masters, those belonging to a lower rank, call them slaves, endorse the norm. Now, slaves may be dissatisfied, but we have stipulated that alternative visions might not yet be epistemically available to them, and they don't have the means to experiment with simply subverting the norms. Now, suppose that through whatever means, a natural catastrophe, war, disaster, internal conflicts between the elites and so on, the society of slaves is challenged and a new one emerges. And people start questioning the way they have organized their basic social institutions and come up with alternative models. So the question is, given these alternatives, would the next generation of members of that society continue to endorse norms of deference to authority based on birth rank? That's where the kind of counterfactual test comes up. Or would the norm continue to be upheld despite the disappearance of the external constraints, subject to domination, epistemic ignorance about alternative views, inability to act on the action of previous generations of slaves? If the answer is no, it means that a body of norms that was at one point contributing to the functional refinement of an ethical code serves its historical purpose no more and is also deficient compared to an alternative system of rule and an alternative way of making decision. So it seems to me that this test places constraints on the conditions on the basis of which we assess different interpretations of the function and purpose of particular institutions, using the methods of trial, failure, and success to examine the solidity of these interpretations. I think I'm going to skip the second objection, and maybe it will come up in question time. I probably just conclude by summarizing what I'm trying to do with this project, which is to think about the idea of political progress as a distinctive way of articulating the normative statements in moral theory and in political theory, and think about the distinctiveness on politics with that regard. And as I say, it's an attempt to think about political progress from a pragmatic, constructivist/pragmatist point of view, in a way that kind of preserves the fallibilist way of proceeding that pragmatic constructivists are committed to, but that also opens up the possibility of thinking about political institutions from a point of view that raises the issue of the plausibility and progressive or regressive nature of these political institutions. And what I do in the project is to try and defend the distinctiveness of political progress in terms of functional refinement of norms of justice, whereby justice seems to be important to a particular way of accounting for the use of political power, whereby power is important because it's an important way through which we address the failures of coordination and continuity that we face even if we are committed to a particular moral theory. So it seems to me that obviously the project needs a lot more unpacking and many more examples and so on, but I think it's also an interesting way for political theory to return to some kind of old-fashioned questions about regime types and issues of institutions and the character of political institutions that are absent so far in some discussions in normative political theory, and also a way of incorporating and linking debates about justice and conceptual debates about justice to debates about the nature of political institutions and different kinds of regimes. And I'll conclude there. Thank you.